What's up, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube? Boogie2988 coming at you live once again through the power of the internet. And right now, there's a bit of a controversy about the topic of the price of video games, whether or not they should still be $60. A lot of YouTubers are talking about it, and I wanted to chime in with my 2 cents. Now, this has been a topic of debate for years. I made a video on it, I think, about 3 years ago, saying that video games probably should not cost $60 with this latest generation. They may need to go up to $70 or $80, even though that means we're probably going to get a lot of people upset at the industry, and maybe even a lot of people bowing out because they can't afford that, or they'll wait for their games to go on sale. But all of this research recently, when the YouTube channel Extra Credits made a video saying that the cost of video games shouldn't be $60 anymore. And he used a lot of common sense tactics to explain this away. I think probably the one that I could never argue with is the fact that they just simply haven't adjusted for the price of inflation. We set that $60 price tag right about the time the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 launched. And if you adjust the price of inflation, 2% a year roughly, video games should cost about $75 or $80 if you wanted to sell it for exactly what you were selling it for back then. But the argument could be made that gaming has a much broader audience than it's ever had before. There are more people playing, and if a game is going to sell really well, if it's a hit, it's going to sell way more copies than it used to sell back when the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 launched. It's going to sell, millions of more copies. So even though you're taking home less profit per copy sold, you would probably still make about as much money. And this, according to Extra Credits, is why we're seeing so much monetization in current video games. And of course, the loot boxes there. But we're talking about going all the way back to the 360 era, where people were selling horse armor DLC for $1 or $2, top hats and Fable and stuff along that lines. Then eventually we started seeing the season pass scam, where you buy this content when you buy the game for upcoming stuff. Of course, there's always been collector's edition. I'm a sucker for collector's editions, as you guys know. And then, of course, most recently, what we call the freemium market. It looks like a free game, except it's a AAA game, and it costs you $60 to buy in, $90 for the season pass, and then they still start hitting you with microtransactions and loot boxes as soon as you load the game. And I am certain that some executives make the argument to everybody, including the developers, that if we put that stuff in the game, it guarantees we'll make our money back. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make our money back. We're trying to double our money if we can. But that's a very old mindset. The idea of just doubling or tripling or quadrupling your money, that's no longer the case. That's not what these companies want to do. They want to make as much money as humanly possible. And there's plenty of cases to make that, they'll prove that point. Rockstar Games is a perfect example. If you look at the games they published since 2000, they published a brand new game once every 2 or 3 years until they published, of course, Grand Theft Auto 5. And then that's pretty much the last thing they published. Now, that game came out in 2013, and I think it sold 1 billion copies of the game. Then they re-released it for the latest generation, but they've also reportedly earned billions. That's billions with a B on microtransactions on GTA 5 Online. They basically took the whole games as a service thing and turned it into an incredibly profitable service. Now, that game is also kind of an exception because it is an incredible game that still sells for $60 today a lot of the times, even on sale. They just lump in a shark card. So it's an impeccable game with an incredible online service. It's probably one of the better examples of what you should or could do if you're going to do games as a service. The point I'm making here is that even though that's a great game and a fairly reasonable example of games as a service, it also proves the point that Rockstar is happy just making money because they are a company. Take-Two Interactive, who owns Rockstar, they are just happy making money. It's all a matter of doing as little work as possible to make as much money as possible. So there's a lot of profit to be made for the shareholders. That's what it all comes down to, is the shareholders. And Rockstar may be considered noble with their GTA 5 Online, but when you compare it to a company like EA, EA doesn't even care if they sell games anymore, much less at the $60 price tag, because that's just the tip of the iceberg to them. In the third quarter of last year alone, they made $787 million off of microtransactions. That's why they're doing this. It's live services is the real cash cow, not selling the games. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if they would sell the games cheaper. They put them on sale sometimes a month after they release them, EA especially. I personally think the idea that just trying to earn your money back on a game or just double or quadruple your money is a farce. I think that's absolutely not their intention. Maybe 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, but today the idea is, again, to do as little work as possible to make as much money as possible. It's a business after all. You know what? That's not always true when it comes to smaller games designed by smaller teams or even individual developers. Most of them just want to create a game. They're going to put it out into the world, and if they make some money from it or make their money back, they are happy. But what I'm talking about is publicly held companies like EA, Ubisoft, Take-Two Interactive. These guys have stockholders to please, and if they don't please them, their company can go belly up. And the truth of the matter is, this mindset's not going to change anytime soon, because plenty of gamers are willing to buy that stuff even on their $60 games, even if they raise the price to $80 games. That stuff is not going away. They're going to continue to sell you microtransactions, at the very least DLC, at the very least as much as they can to try to maximize profit, especially companies like EA, who, by the way, when they announced these earnings and that $787 million worth of microtransactions, the value of their stock went up 7% that day, because even though they had all that Star Wars trouble, it never really hurt them in the end. The stock dipped, but now it's worth much more than it was before the whole Star Wars debacle, because even though the audience was mad, even though gamers were mad, even though those of us who chose not to buy the game were mad, the people who did buy that game, you know they're buying microtransactions, and they're definitely doing it with their team sports and their Sims 4 and all that other stuff. But I don't think you need to argue economics or understand economics to understand this. All you have to do is see the microtransactions themselves, see the loot boxes, see the card packs, see that stuff, and see how many deep levels of psychological manipulation that goes into this stuff. You look at the Activision patents, you look at all this other stuff. Just by experiencing and playing the games themselves, it should be pretty well obvious how manipulative this stuff is, and that shows intent. You're not going to hide the most powerful characters and the most powerful weapons and the most powerful skills in a game behind a bunch of random loot boxes to psychologically manipulate people into spending as much money as humanly possible. You would not do that if your goal was just to earn your money back. You will do that to try to drain somebody out of every penny they get. It's no better than somebody doing the little shell game or the card game on a street corner. They're hustling. Those are hustlers. That's what hustlers do, is they trick you. Extra Life also made the argument that one of the reasons we're seeing this rise in cost of video games and these exploitive practices is also because the cost of creating video games is more expensive than it's ever been. And he has some really good points there when he talks about how many people it takes to make current games, not just for the engines themselves and licensing the engines and doing the incredible art. And we're expecting 4K graphics at 60 frames per second. We expect the game to be bug-free, and we expect them to be massive worlds with a lot of stuff to do. And because of that, $50 million might not even make a AAA video game anymore. $100 million might not. Sometimes we've seen video games like Destiny, which I think was rumored to cost $200 million to create. And there's definitely a good point there to be made. However, in that same video, he did go on to say that the marketing budget is often as big as the development budget as a whole. So if they spend $20 million to make the video game, they spend about $20 million to market it. I really think there's a lot of fat that could be trimmed there, but that's neither here nor there. I don't think that is an excuse for all these manipulative tactics that we're seeing in video games, such as loot boxes and Star Wars Battlefront 2. I don't think it is a bypass. I think genuinely that if you cannot sell a video game at $60 and make enough profit and sell enough copies of it to include your marketing budget as well as your development cost, you probably don't need to be making video games. And if you have to, do what Nintendo started doing, which is start giving us actual real DLC with their video games at a reasonable price that keeps people hired. Or pointing back to Rockstar again. Rockstar is certainly not the best example, but it is a good example. Overwatch is another good example. I wish they would ditch the loot boxes and be a little bit more like League of Legends, but at least it's only cosmetic there, and you get a ton of free content with a game like Overwatch, which, by the way, still sells for about $60 for a new copy because the game is well worth it. At the end of the day, I personally do not feel that there is any excuse for psychologically manipulative tactics. I don't think that there is any excuse for those Activision patents where they talk about psychologically manipulating the player. I don't think that there's any reason to take a chunk of the content out of the base game and hide it as part of the day one DLC. I just don't think that's fair or reasonable, and I do not generally support those games unless I get a review copy, and if I get a review copy, I generally complain about that stuff so you guys know better. And I think anyone with a brain who looks at this is going to realize that this is not about making your money back. This isn't about keeping up with the price of inflation. This isn't about anything other than maximizing profit. That is, once again, what a business is about to do. I do think you can do it without exploitive tactics. I do think you can do it without the bullshit. And I really hope that they choose to. but they're not going to, because Ubisoft and EA and Rockstar and Activision and all these different companies are making more money than they could possibly spend, and their stock value continues to shoot up because of it. And you know what? Gamers continue to buy it, and that's my fault as much as it is anybody else's, I guess, because I do play games like Hearthstone. I will deal with those card packs. I make the excuse that it's free to play, since I never had to spend anything, and I often do play those games for hours, months, almost a year straight since I have spent money in Hearthstone. However, I'm part of the problem. And you know what? I'm willing to give extra credit where it's due, pun intended. I think he's smart enough to know that this isn't a noble pursuit, making video games. It's about making money, and that's why they are doing this stuff, especially with these larger companies. He knows there's some nefariousness there. I think maybe he's playing some sort of devil's advocacy here, or maybe he's talking about smaller developers in a lot of ways. But for the most part, I think anyone with a brain who looks at this situation is obviously going to come across the fact that they are for-profit corporations that just want to maximize profit to please stockholders. It's plain as the nose on my face. As for the solution, I don't know that there is one. We would like for them to stop doing it. Maybe there could be some sort of government intervention, but that would be the last thing I would ever want. I would like to see customers voting with their wallet, but the reality of it is plenty of us are. A lot of you who watch me won't invest in that kind of stuff, but there's a lot of people who don't watch me or any other YouTuber who grew up with that stuff being part of their video games. They're 14 or 15, 16 right now, and they're spending mom and dad's money doing it. They have no reason to think it should be any other way. They grew up with an iPad in front of them, and they're used to these types of things, so I think this is probably just how it's going to be here to stay, and you and I are going to have to choose not to play those games that have that stuff and choose games that are complete experiences instead. And a lot of the times, that's going to need to be indie games. And if and when these big companies do get it right and they release smaller games or complete games for a reasonable price, you and I have to pick those up and play them, and hopefully encourage other people to do the same thing so they get the idea that they might be able to go back to the old way of doing things and still make almost as much money. But they're always going to choose to maximize profits, and that's the situation we find ourselves in. Bleak, I know, but video games are still pretty fun, and there's still plenty of people out there. And you know what? If you continue to support independent developers who make very, very good games for a very reasonable price, those guys can become the next big company. And fingers crossed, they'll do the right thing when it's their turn up to bat. Guys, as always, thanks for watching. I love you very much, and I'll speak with you again soon. And next time they try to sell you some microtransactions, do what I'm trying to do these days. Keep your credit card in your pocket.